Hello and welcome to the first in a series of videos on Chapter 9 of Government in America. This chapter focuses on campaigns and voting behavior. I think this is going to wind up being a 5 video chapter, but we may be able to get it done in 4, so we'll see. Before we begin, I should make a note about Chapter 9 of this text. It focuses very heavily on presidential campaigns, which, while they have a lot of things in common with campaigns for other positions in the United States government, do have some unique quirks. So we'll go through it. We're going to go through the presidential system, and as we close up on that, we'll just sort of make sure that we're clear on what is unique to the presidential situation and what's can be carried over to other positions. So one thing that you kind of have to have down right off the bat that does apply to not just presidential campaigns, but national races for the House of Representatives or the Senate, or even state and local races like for governor or mayor or city council or what have you, is that usually there are 2 elections to get to any particular job or position. First, each party has to figure out who's going to represent that party in the contest for the job. So there's a nomination process. The nomination is the right to represent a party in an overall election. Now, that overall election, where one person from the Democrats and one person from the Republicans, and maybe one person from the Greens and one person from the Libertarians, and so on and so forth. That election is called the general election. And so the winner of the general election is the one who gets to have the job. Now, most times the parties will decide on who is going to be the nominee in the general election by holding a primary election. That's an election with different rules on who can participate that is designed to result in one nominee for each party. We discussed primaries in Chapter 8 and talked about some different types and some different rules. There are a few places that have primaries where you don't just wind up with one person from each party. So you want to make sure that you have that down. But overall, the idea is the primary is where each party gets its nominee. Then each party has its nominee run in the general election. And when we vote in the general election, we decide who gets the job. Now, that having been said, we're going to look at the presidential process, which is much more complicated. And I think that the most logical way to do that is to start at the end of the process and then work backwards from there, because it's hard to understand why the beginning of the process is set up the way that it is until you understand what the whole thing is aiming for. So that's the way that we're going to look at this. We're going to start at the end and work our way a little bit backwards. Okay, so the nomination story for president ends at each party's national party convention, which is a set of meetings held every 4 years where the members of the party send representatives to discuss how are things going to work within the party, what does the party stand for, what is the platform going to be, how are certain procedures going to be handled, and at the convention, the members, the representatives, officially declare who their presidential and vice presidential nominees are going to be. The people who make these decisions, these representatives that go to the convention, are called delegates. So the first thing to remember is a bunch of delegates from all over the country go to the convention and decide on a bunch of things, including officially voting on the presidential and vice presidential nominee. So these delegates are the prize. These delegates are what people who want the nomination need. You need to have a majority of the delegates from your party support you in order to get your party's nomination for president. It's not enough to have a plurality, to have more votes than anyone else. You need to have 50% plus one of the delegates vote for you. And if they don't, if you get 49.9% of the delegates, then they have another vote. They have to keep doing this until they come up with one. Now, in recent history, they haven't had to do this because people have gone into the convention knowing who the nominee was going to be. But in the past, when the system was different, sometimes it would take the delegates dozens of ballots before they actually came up with the nominee, and there had to be some compromises. So if the delegates are the prize that the candidates or would-be candidates are after, and the delegates have the power to decide who the nominee is going to be, the next question is, who picks the delegates? How do people get the right to be a delegate and go to the convention and make this decision? The answer to that is that voters do, sort of, within certain limits. The national party organizations set up a list of how many delegates each state is going to get to send to the convention. And they base this on a number of factors, including the population of the state, how much the state has supported the party in the past, and things like that. Then once everybody knows how many delegates come from each state's party organization then figures out the system and sets up the rules for how those delegates are going to be divided up by people who want to be the nominee. So, in order to understand how someone gets a nomination for president, you actually have to look on a state-by-state basis and figure out which states have which kinds of systems in order to figure out how to get the delegates that you need to vote for you and make you the nominee. So one way that a state organization could decide to distribute its delegates is to do it in a similar way to the way that parties decide nominations for other races. You can hold a primary election. Now, this could be an open primary where people who are registered with any party can come vote, or it could be a closed primary where only people who are registered with that party are able to vote in that primary. Pennsylvania, for example, is a closed primary state. Only registered Republicans can vote in the Republican primary. Only registered Democrats can vote in the Democratic primary. People have to get on the ballot and run in this primary election, and then we look at the results and see what happens. Now, another decision that the state organizations have to make after they've decided to hold a primary election is, how are we going to use the results of the primary to distribute the delegates? They could do it in a winner-take-all fashion, similar to the way that the Electoral College works in most states. So whoever gets a plurality of the votes in that state's primary election gets all of that state's delegates, committed to him or her at the convention. This puts a lot of pressure on candidates to win those states, and if you don't win the state, then you can fall behind very early. So another system that is used is proportional allocation. The idea being that if you get 25% of the votes, you should get 25% of the delegates from that state. And then there are modified proportional rules where you have to meet a certain minimum percentage before you get any, or so on and so forth. But you get the idea. Winner take all is, like it says, the winner gets the bounty, and the person who comes in second or third gets nothing, or some variation of proportional where there's more of a mix. Okay. Now, in addition to primaries, there are also caucuses. Caucuses are meetings, basically, where people show up and talk to each other about the candidates and maybe hear presentations from the candidate's campaign. And then they, after having talked amongst themselves, then they hold a vote for who should get the delegates from that state. Now, because of the meetings and the talking and things like that, people who go to a caucus often have to be willing to stay longer. It's not just walk into a booth, push some buttons, and go. And they have to be willing to share their views in public. It's not a secret ballot, in a lot of cases. So caucuses generally tend to have fewer people attend and participate than primary elections do. So if a state is using a caucus to pick its nominee or who gets its delegates, then the trick is you need a smaller number of people in order to win, but the people that you get have to be really, really committed. Looking back at 2008, when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were running against each other for the Democratic nomination, one of the reasons why Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton is he was able to get more people to show up at these caucus states and really commit and be at those meetings. And as a result, he was able to build up a delegate lead in the caucus states, whereas if it had been a primary, the Clinton campaign might have been able to get a better percentage and maybe even be able to have gotten more delegates. So the primary versus caucus distinction is one of those variables that you have to look at when you're looking at who you think is going to get the delegates from each state. Okay, we're going to stop here on this video, but there's still a lot more to talk about with caucuses and primaries, including the order in which they happen. So that'll be coming in the next video. Until then, I leave you with these questions for further thought and discussion.